All right, let's talk about a couple of things, which are approval processes with parallel approvers, and then keeping system in sync with outbound messaging. All right, so parallel approvers, what's this referring to? Well, in your approval process, one of the things that is available to you is to in one of your steps is to set the approver to be multiple people. So we could come out here and select Amy, select Andrew, and so we can define our approvers in our steps as being multiple people. What this means is that simultaneously or in parallel, these people will be notified that they need to approve a record. And then what's going to happen is that we have the option of saying, all right, do we want to require a unanimous approval, or do we want to allow the first person to respond to make the decision? Whether they approve it or reject it, whoever gets there first, that will determine what happens with this record. Okay. There is no voting thing, so it's not like the Senate where we can require a supermajority and Al Franken to come in. Yes, go ahead.
So is it a way to make it, instead of having to explicitly list people, to make it based on, say, a public group or a queue?
Yeah. Well, there's some stuff we can do with
managers of the people or something, so you don't have to, like, if somebody gets fired, you don't have to keep updating lists.
Well, there's, it's the way it works is that there's some options up here that, with in the case of having multiple parallel approvers, it only applies to users and a setting called related users, which is what I'm going to punt on that one, because in our dynamic approval process, I'll talk about what a related user is. But that allows us to do something more dynamic. But the rows here do not apply to the things above, so it is a radio button in the sense that I think what you're getting at is, can I identify multiple managers or something like that?
It may be managers in different departments.
Yeah.
It's a
I know what you're saying.
thing.
Yeah. So the multiple row thing here only applies to user and related user, but perhaps when I show you what related user does, that'll satisfy the business case that you're maybe looking for. Okay, but we'll come back to that very soon, because that's our upcoming topic. All right. So in exercise 3-5, what you're going to do is you are going to create a parallel approval process by editing an existing process and then identifying multiple approvers that would be notified in parallel. The advantage of parallel is that it increases, you don't have to wait in a serial fashion for one after the other to log in and take care of it. So conceivably it can take a lot less time. Okay. Let me jump to talk about dynamic approval process, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about outbound messaging. So, all right. So dynamic approval routing. There's a feature called where we can refer to a related user for who the approver is. What I was showing you back there that I said I was going to punt. Now, what this enables us to do is to mark the current record that is submitted for approval to contain who the approvers would be. Okay? So we would decorate or mark on our record who the approvers are for that particular record. All right? Then in our approval process, we would reference those users as the approvers. Okay? Let me show you what we would do. So the first thing that we would do is we'd go out to our object definition. In this case, here's the position. And notice that there's 3 fields here that are doing lookups to users. Approver number 1, approver number 2, and approver number 3. Okay? Now, once the record that's being submitted for approval has these lookups to users, now in our approval process, in one of our steps, we can reference those users, one or many of those users. Okay? So if I select here, I can select related user. And notice that when I select the drop-down list, it has all of the fields which are related to this current object, or related from this current object. Okay? So in this step, I could say, all right, whichever user was selected for approver number 1, let's use them as the approver for step number 1. Okay? And so on and so forth. All right. Another thing that we could do, now if we think about the way this is going to work right now, a user would edit the record and determine who the approvers are. So they'd edit the record and they go, all right, here's my position, and the approver, if I click on the edit button, the approver is going to be, I could enter in Craig. So here's Craig Kingman, so I could enter in my different approvers here. Now, maybe you want to automate that. So let's think about how this might work within universal containers. Maybe we have a situation where we go, if this is a position which is in the support department, then here are the 3 approvers for that support department. And if there are, if this is for the finance department, here are the 3 approvers for that department. Okay? So if it's finance, we want to send it to the VP of finance. If it's support, we want to send it to the VP of support. Okay? So instead of letting the user make that selection, we could fully automate this by creating another object. And what we do is that next step in our process, which is we could go out here and create another object, in this case called position approval matrix. And I'll take a look at one of these. And what it is this is a record in which we select a department, and then we identify who are the 3 approvers for that department. So in this case, this is engineering. I have another one here, which is, what was this one? Support. So why don't I do finance? Okay, so let's see, make sure there's not a finance one. There is not. All right, so new approval matrix. This one is for finance. We don't need to do a priority. And Megan Smith is going to be approver number 1, and Cynthia needs to always approve it. And then I'm going to make, let's see, I already picked Megan, I think. Where's another person who's a director? There we go, Frank. Okay, so Frank is going to be our approver number 3. So now what I've done is I've created a definition via a record and a custom object of who the approvers would be. Now, how do I map this over to my approver fields that were on my position record? Well, what I would do is I could add an apex trigger, and I could do a lookup, and I could say look up my position approval matrix custom object and select the record for the finance department. And get that record, and specifically I want you to select the fields approver 1, 2, and 3. Get those user IDs, and now I want you to update the position, and I want you to update the position with those user IDs. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So we could implement that through an Apex trigger. All right. Great question. So, so now in the Apex class, we actually write the code here. But let me show you the way that this is going to work.
Is that 501?
501. Yeah, that's our programming class that we have. All right, so the way that this works is that our position object is referencing those 3 users. Now there's a trigger, and the trigger is the thing with the yellow explosion in the lower left-hand corner. And this is some code that exists up on the server that when an insert or an update of a position record occurs, we fire off the trigger. Okay? And when we fire off the trigger, it's going to call some code in this position approval class, and it's going to do a lookup in the database. And it's going to say, return for me the record where the department on the position approval matrix is equal to the department on my position. So get me the associated position approval matrix. Then get the 3 user IDs, and let's now go out and populate the position record. Then let's commit it to the database, so now that we've updated that. All right. So a trigger, Apex trigger, is think of it as a procedure, a function of code or a block of code which executes when a database write event occurs. Very similar to a workflow rule in the sense that it is only fired, or a validation rule for that matter, it's fired based on the database write. Okay.
So you couldn't set up a workflow to do something similar?
No, because let's see, what's the problem with that? One of the things, I think, when you look at like what are the alternatives, if you did a field update, the field update would need to be able to dynamically figure out who is the approver based on the department. You could update, you could do a workflow rule that did a field update, but then it would always update the field to be the same value.
You
right?
can only update one field?
What's that?
You can only update one field?
Only update one field.
Could you do a VLOOKUP in the formula?
No, well, VLOOKUP only works in validation rules. Yeah. The other thing is that, yeah.
But on the workflow, can you assign it to a queue so it will update it to a list of people? Because for example, you have like 1 or 2 or 3 approver there. You can set them up as a queue. And then, so update that one. If department equals this, then workflow.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's some stuff we could do if we finagled it enough. But with the trigger, we have the ability to query the database, get the associated users, and then update the current record. So this is dynamic in the sense that the user, we could in fact, not only is it dynamic, but we could then use field level security to protect this. So we might make, through field level security, the approver 1, 2, and 3 fields read only. But our code can then update the record with who the approvers are, right? Okay. Any, okay.
Is the point of having the approver 1, 2, and 3 that's comparable to steps 1, 2, and 3, so respectively?
Oh, yeah, we just had 3 different lookup fields to users, and so they don't have to map. You might have, you know, a field, I mean, it could be VP, or you could call it, you know, create them for purposes that, you know, it doesn't have to be 1, 2, and 3. Yeah. You could do something where maybe you have 4 approvers, and then maybe, you know, it's used for different purposes, like approving candidates, or I don't know.
Right.
And then,
but different steps in the process.
Yeah, yeah. So you could make it flexible enough so that sometimes you use 2 approvers, other times you only use 1 or something like that. So.
And it's just a design decision that you would stick the approver, the usernames into the position record rather than a reference to the position approval matrix. Right?
Well,
or you can't in the approval process you can't look stuff up either.
Yeah, it's related user.
Right.
If you can't do, you can't reference the value that might be contained within a formula field. I think that's what you're getting at. So maybe we would, our position would have a lookup to a position approval matrix. And then we would go, oh, okay, let's have 3 formula fields, but we can't pull, you know, we could not use those in our approval process, the formula field values, in order to determine who, you know, which user, because it's only based on a related user. So it must have a lookup to a user, in other words.
So formula fields are not related users.
No, formula fields is just, I mean, it's going out. You could set up a formula field that goes out to a related user, or I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're getting at maybe is if you had a formula field in which we, well, first of all, we would need a lookup relationship to a position approval matrix record. Then we would have a formula field that goes up to the associated position approval matrix record, gets the user number 1 field or approver number 1 field, and then displays it on the page. The problem with that is that in our approval process, we can't reference the value of the formula field. We can only reference a related user field. So it has to do with kind of a typing thing with the way they built it. So, all right. Okay, this is actually another thing that's out on developer.force.com. So there's code out there if you want to take a look at it and see how it's implemented. The nice thing is that because you've created these custom objects, they're records now that you could, you know, one of your administrators could then go out and define a new record if, let's say, there's a new department or a new set of people or a new pick list option. So by simply editing, you know, this record, or they could, let's say that the VP of finance leaves the company. It's like, uh-oh, all right, well now we're continuing to send approvals to him. Well, the administrator could go out, update approver number 2 field on that position approval matrix, and then now from that point on, it's no longer going to the person who left the company. Okay. All right, let's do this. Let's allocate some time. Why don't we'll do a little bit of lab time, and then we'll do one more lecture before the end of the day. But let's do a little bit more lab time. We'll take a break, or not a break, but break from lecture. And then we'll work on the labs until, let's say, 4:45, 20 minutes from now. And then we'll do our outbound messaging topic. That'll be our last topic for the day. And then, like I said, we will devote the rest of the day to lab time. Okay? All right, let's talk about outbound messaging. It is the 4th action that we haven't used yet, one of our workflow actions. So our scenario here at Universal Containers is that they have an external system, their human resources system, and they'd like to keep the information in sync. What they can do is every time a job application is approved, we're going to take some of that information and place it into the HR system. Okay, so we're gonna create a or utilize a workflow rule that calls a workflow action of type outbound messaging in order to take that data and post it over to the HR system. So outbound messaging is sending record information over to an external system, a URL, via a SOAP web service message. Okay, it utilizes SOAP and WSDL. So WSDL is the Web Services Definition Language, which is an XML document which describes what this outbound message will send to the target system. And then the format of what we send over there is going to be a SOAP message. Okay. Let's see here. Now, to take a look at an outbound message, the way that this works is that you would define a new outbound message and you would identify, well, what type of data would this outbound message be sending? Okay, and what type of, what would this object be? So in this case here, if I did something like I select candidate information, okay, I can call this my demo outbound message. Okay. The endpoint URL is going to be the URL of the system that we're going to take this XML document that we produce and post it to this system. So I'd enter in a URL of a system that I would be, whatever it is, the system that I'm posting to. So my SOAP server dot salesforce.com, whatever, or whatever your URL is. Okay. It says user to send as. This is referring to when we are sending this data over to this other system, it's going to adhere to our security requirements. So this is applying who will be sending the message. So you're going to want to take into account the accessibility that this person has towards this particular record, or I should say, not really record, but object level CRUD and that kind of stuff, field level access for accessing that. It says send session ID, and what this is for is when we post that message over to the target server, we can send a session ID for our user, and then the target system can use that session ID to then respond back to Salesforce by logging into Salesforce, not really logging in I should say, but using the session ID to go back to Salesforce to then, for instance, send back some sort of ACK or some sort of receipt that says, okay, we've successfully entered this into the HR system, whatever it may be, or Mark, you could, I don't know, do something. So. For instance, one of the things you could do is create a custom web service in Apex, and then over on your .NET server or your Java server that's implementing the web service that we're calling, you could then use that session ID to then call back to us and say, mark this on this record as being received, or something along those lines. Okay. The other thing is, well, what data? This is a pretty basic thing in terms of what it does, in the sense that it's just posting data for the current record over to the system. So what this is going to do is, these are all candidate records, so here, or candidate fields. So I can identify. I'm just going to do a bunch of these. What exactly I want to contain within that XML document that I'm sending over to the target system. And then finally, now that I've created my web service, now I have the WSDL which is available. And so this is the XML document that I would then take in over to my .NET server, or if I was using Apache Axis, I would use WSDL to Java to generate the proxy or stub code that would then implement or create the listener that would be called when the message is received over on the target system. Okay? So, all right.
Question?
Yeah.
So, what would be the example of using outbound messaging?
Oh, you mean,
or how
well,
it would look like?
Well, our use case was the HR system. So, we have our recruiting application, but maybe we have a database of employee data or something like that. And we want to automate creating an employee record for one of our candidates, something like that. So it's a pretty easy way, at least from the Salesforce side, to be able to say, all right, let's take some data and post it out to this other system. The challenge here is that when you're writing the code over in the server that's implementing the web services, then writing the logic to then do something with this, like updating your HR system or some other system.
So it's actually, so what it does is actually taking the data from Salesforce,
yeah,
and send it to another system,
yeah,
and updating that system,
yeah,
kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's say that within another system, we are tracking position information. So a change made to the data in Salesforce, we want that change to also be made to that second system that also contains a list of positions. With outbound messaging, when a user, for instance, we could create a workflow rule that when a change occurs, now let's post that data, out to that external system to essentially keep it in sync.
So, do we need to do anything furthermore to write in between in integration to make sure the receiving side will take it correctly?
Oh yeah, that's the hard part.
Okay.
So the missing part here is in whatever language you choose to write I guess you could use some sort of middleware tool that possibly doesn't involve coding. But typically what people would do is they'd use .NET or Apache Axis, which is Java, and they would import the WSDL into one of those environments to automatically generate some code. But ultimately, that code is simply going to parse and process the message. They need to write the logic to then do something with it, so that now they're going to execute some code to, for instance, do a JDBC connection to,
So it's actually a two-step process. One is the information sent out from Salesforce. It will be a bunch of code, and then on the other receiving end, they have to do another, write another set of code to take these code from Salesforce to make sense of it.
Yeah, we're automating the code generation from our side, so you're not coding anything here. But from the other side, there might be something like a middleware tool, some sort of messaging hub that would allow you to do this without programming. But like I said, typically on the other side, you're writing that code to then process the data to do something with it.
Now when you send that, are you able to send it over is there any configuration that we can do without writing code for an SSL connection so that?
I think by default it uses SSL, yeah. One of the things that we have is the ability to generate a certificate for your org that would then be imported, or I don't know what the term is, but you take that certificate from Salesforce.com, load it into the target system to use to establish that SSL connection between us and the target application server or web service server.
So can we send these outbound messages between a Salesforce app to another Salesforce app?
There's limitations that we place on communicating between sort of doing a web service call out to Salesforce, I know that there's certain circumstances where if we write some Apex code, we can't do a web service call out to call a web service in Salesforce. We block people from doing call outs to Salesforce. You know, I think that there's probably a few things that they're trying to prevent, like endless loops or stuff like that. But
But are there any other ways
yes.
of transferring data? Maybe
Yes.
Salesforce
So
to
okay.
Salesforce?
So if you're talking about, it's called Salesforce to Salesforce. So if you have multiple orgs, you can transfer data between those orgs using a feature called Salesforce to Salesforce.
Also, the feature itself is called Salesforce.
The feature itself is called Salesforce to Salesforce. So here under application setup is Salesforce to Salesforce, and then what you do is what happens. I'm not too knowledgeable about this. I've seen a presentation, but it was a 20-minute presentation on this topic. What you do is you enable it, and then you send out an invite to the other org. Someone would need to log into the other org, accept your invite, and then send it back. And then what you do is you decide what information you would like to share with the other org. So within your object, you go, okay, you know, these are the fields that I'd like to share with the other org. And so it's a way to sort of automate integration between two different orgs. So if you have something like, maybe you're a reseller or something like that, or maybe you're the one who's making the product, but you have resellers, and so you want to share cases with them, so that if they're supporting, you know, you're selling product to the reseller, and the reseller selling it to customers, you want to share your cases with them, so they know here's the things, the problems we've run across, and you can search through essentially your cases now, because we're sort of replicating that data to your org. And so you can use that or do something like that using Salesforce to Salesforce. Okay.
Why is it not reversible? It's like Mafia.
Why is it not?
There
Oh.
There is a way in, but there is no way out.
There's no way out.
Well, why just you can take it?
Your analogies scare me.
Yeah, I know. I don't know about the Turkish mafia, but our mafia is a lot worse. I don't know. This must do something that, you know, I don't know. I don't know why this is a not reversible thing. So
how does that integrate with workflow once you enable all this stuff and agree to the exchange? Does it
Oh.
start showing up?
You know, I don't know if it's necessarily workflow related, where you, you know, what's the trigger for actually sharing the case with your partner company. I'm not sure how that works. Yeah, it's a whole nother thing that I'm just not too knowledgeable about.
Is it on the CRM site or
Oh, it's it's definitely. So it's not like. It's just that this is just my lack of knowledge, and in the user's guide, let's see if I can see it. Salesforce to Salesforce. So there's a whole section on Salesforce to Salesforce. So.
It says we can associate an outbound message with the workflow approval process.
Yes, that's outbound message. Salesforce to Salesforce is another thing, though. Yeah. So now that we have the outbound message, now it's like any other workflow action. So now we can reference it either in a workflow or as a workflow action within one of our approval processes. Okay. All right.
where was that help page again?
And you were looking for the Salesforce to Salesforce? Boy, I completely, you're, It is in the user's guide, and if you, yeah, oh, that didn't do it. If you go to Help and Training and you click on Help, you can either download the PDF or you can click on Customize. Oh, this is a long list. Salesforce to Salesforce. There we go. And there you go. Okay. Yep. So let's do this. It's almost 5 o'clock. Let's continue to work on 3-5, 3-6, 3-7, or for that matter, any lab exercises that you haven't yet completed. And we'll devote the rest of the day to working on those labs. And then tomorrow morning, we will start things off with doing our little recap and talking about auditing. Okay? All right. Why don't we get going on day 4? Yesterday, we talked about business processes, and we talked about a number of things. I just want to kind of quickly do a little recap about the topics that we covered. So we talked about, in the morning, we talked about functions and functions that we can utilize within our formulas. So we talked about a lot of stuff that we could do within both formula fields and within validation rules. We utilized in our formula fields the image and the hyperlink functions to generate and embed images and hyperlinks into our pages. We utilized a few different functions in our validation rules, things like is-pick-val, if statements. We utilized regex. We did some conditional logic whereby we took a look at the value of another field in order to make a second field required. We also did a sort of an advanced technique with roll-up summaries. One of the things that we did was we, using a roll-up summary, we calculated a count on the number of child records, and then we used that as a mechanism to prevent someone from adding or removing a record associated with a job application. Another thing that we did, so in addition to the regex, checking the format of our zip codes and our social security numbers, we also utilized VLOOKUP, and VLOOKUP enabled us to go out to some unrelated table in order to do a lookup, almost like a select statement in a SQL query. Okay. All right, so that was the morning. We did a bunch of exercises there. And then in the afternoon, what was the main thing that we talked about? Does anyone remember what was the main thing?
Approvals?
Approval processes, very good, yeah. So we created approval processes. Approval processes in terms of the declarative features is definitely the most complex component that you'll configure. What are some of the things that we set up in our approval process?
How many people should approve?
Yeah, okay. So Anu was saying steps. Mauricio, you were saying who, and that's basically the same thing, which is when you identify your steps, there's a number of things that you're setting up, but you're identifying who is going to be the approver for this process. In our case, we did a number of different variations. We identified users. We used the manager of the submitter option. We also set up some parallel approval processes so we could send it out to multiple people at the same time. We also utilized the related user feature in our steps so that we could reference a user on the record being submitted for approval. Okay. And then what else did we set up in our approval processes?
What was being approved?
Actions, and then what was being approved. Okay, so two important things. So the first thing is which things are going to be allowed to be submitted to the process. In other words, our entry criteria for the process, where we could either create rule criteria where we could specify, this field equals this, or we could write a formula that was our entry criteria. In addition, we also specified actions in a number of different places. So our approval process would automate performing actions on our data when, for instance, either it was initially submitted, when a step had completed successfully or been accepted or rejected, and then at the end of the entire process, we also set up approval actions, rejection actions, and recall actions, right? Okay. So a number of different actions. And then finally, as a part of our process definitions, we also set up stuff like, using an email template, who are the allowable submitters, when they go into the app, what would they see in terms of when they click on to approve or reject, what fields would we display. So there's a whole, there's a large number of features that are available or tunable or configurable associated with our approval processes. Okay. What else did we do yesterday afternoon in addition to approval processes?
Apex.
Well, Apex? Well, we implemented some Apex, yeah. So as a part of our dynamic approval process, we implemented some Apex. Outbound messaging, yeah, so very good. So outbound messaging allows us to, utilizing web services, post an XML document to some other system. And what it does is it utilizes a WSDL compliant web service. And so ultimately we create an XML message that whereby the specification that we implement is the SOAP specification for ultimately the envelope and the actual document for the web service that we standard that we use. All right, so outbound messaging, that was one of our actions. What else did we do yesterday?
We skipped.
Skip steps, that was a part of approval process. What was the workflow? What kind of workflow?
Time-dependent.
Time-dependent workflow, exactly. So time-dependent workflow. So time-dependent workflow, can someone describe to me what would be a use case for time-dependent workflow, or what does time-dependent workflow do for us?
Things like reminders.
Exactly. So it's reminders, follow-ups. So the classic thing is that you have the critical something that needs to be handled in the next 10 days. And after 10 days, it's still critical. It still meets the entry criteria for the workflow rule. Well, let's send a reminder or assign a task to someone and have them follow up, okay? So it provides us a way to, light a fire or to get the ball rolling for stuck processes or whatever it may be. Okay. All right, so that leads us into the final module today, which is auditing really. There's a couple of aspects to auditing, and we'll talk about both of those. So we're going to talk about auditing from the stand. By the way, are there any questions before we go? Anything from the last 3 days? Yeah, Mauricio.
Besides XML outbound, is it possible to use another standard format like flat files or CSV?
No. So the question is, other than standard XML web service, what are the options? And is flat files one of them? And so, in terms of us communicating to the outside world where we're initiating the contact, there's really two options. We can utilize a WSDL compliant SOAP web service. So that's kind of the default, most common one that you'll see. Now, in addition, we could write some Apex code to implement a RESTful web service. And in that case, we could do something like, you know, in the case of, I guess you could, you know, it's not something that we've done, but in the case of the class, what we've always done is to manually build up our own XML document. But I guess you could technically create your own, doesn't necessarily have to be XML, but what we do is we always, I guess the requirement is that we always have to use HTTP as our communication transport. But, you know, when I think about the document actually that's going, the body of the message, technically it doesn't have to be XML. So you could put really anything in the body of that document that you're posting. So probably you could. It's not something that I've tried, but I assume you can. We've always gone the route of building up an XML document, but I don't see what would stop you from simply creating a giant, a binary large object block, or just a string of data or something like that. So, yeah, okay.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.